we've looked at the different types of lone workers. What does that mean for you as a company? What is your obligation to these lone workers to protect them? Well, as we mentioned earlier, legislation varies a lot across jurisdictions. Penalties do as well. But when you boil it down, the common denominator is really this. Lone worker legislation requires that organizations take all reasonable measures to ensure the safety of employees. So what we're going to do is take a look at the legislation and a couple of famous cases from both Canada and the U.S. Now we're going to start with Canada. So let's look at the federal legislation. Bill C-45. The criminal code has been amended such that organizations and even individuals may be criminally liable for failure to take reasonable measures to protect employee safety. So this seems pretty broad in scope, but what the federal government has done is they leave it up to the provincial government to then mandate specific lone worker requirements. So while you can still be held liable from a federal perspective, the actual specifics in terms of lone workers is left to the provinces to define. So let's look at how that legislation came about. For those on the line from Canada, you may remember the very unfortunate incident in Nova Scotia from the West Ray mine disaster. So in this incident, we had a group of workers in isolation. Very tragic. 26 miners were killed, and there was a public inquiry as a result of this disaster that revealed miner safety was completely ignored with this incident. And there were 2 managers that were charged with 26 counts of manslaughter and criminal negligence causing death. However, the failure to prosecute them, so the inability to prosecute them based on existing laws, was actually what prompted Bill C-45. So while this was a very tragic incident, it did bring about change that has had a great positive impact on a lot of employees with operations in Canada. So what does Bill C-45 mean in terms of penalties? Well, it can mean 10 to 25 years imprisonment for individuals deemed criminally liable. It can result in a $100,000 fine for a summary conviction with 0 maximum for an indictable offense. So some extremely hefty penalties. And we always like to say, you know, lone worker monitoring, when you consider the penalties that you could possibly face, is really your insurance policy. It's not a cost to your organization. It's an insurance policy against penalties. So let's look at the provincial legislation. So as I mentioned, the provincial legislation does get more specific. Now we're not going to go into detail on all the different legislations across the provinces. They're all available online if you want to learn more, or simply let us know and we can send you a list of those. But the fines do vary as well. So just as a couple of examples, in Alberta, we have up to $500,000 for the first offense against lone worker compliance, $30,000 per day for that the offense continues, and then for a subsequent offense, up to $1 million with $60,000 per day that the offense continues. And then, you know, on the lower end, you've got, for example, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia with $250,000 for the first offense and $25,000 per day. So some pretty substantial fines. So let's look stateside. So here we have OSHA 1915.84, which states, whenever an employee is working alone, such as in a confined space or isolated location, the employer shall account for each employee, A, throughout each work shift at regular intervals, at the end of the job assignment or work shift, and the employer shall account for each employee by sight or verbal communication. So you see a much more specific legislation here than you see in the federal side in Canada. Now, when we went looking for a famous case to help illustrate that here, we came across a very compelling investigative report released by the Investigative Reporting Program from UC Berkeley. Now, if anyone wants more details on this after the webinar, please feel free to let us know. We'll be happy to share the link with you. And this investigative report looked at, it was called Rape on the Night Shift, and it looked at the prevalence of sexual assault and rape among female janitors. So in particular, it features a case against ABM, which is, I'm sure, a company that most people on the line are familiar with, a pretty large corporation that provides janitors all across North America. And there were 21 women in California who were represented by the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission in a suit claiming that ABM failed to protect them from assault. And that case resulted in a $5.8 million payout, so quite a substantial payout. And I really want to draw attention to the quote from the lead attorney on the case. She said, "We did not believe they did all they could, and they allowed those women for years to be abused." So one thing of interest to note here is that even in jurisdictions where perhaps you don't have a specific lone worker monitoring clause, this would still apply under workplace violence legislation or care of duty legislation. In either case, lone worker monitoring is incredibly important for any of those employees in those situations. So we're going to take a little break. Chris, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay. Thank you. There's a lot of great content covered in that first part, Lone Worker 101. We're going to use this as a quick 30-second break. We're going to give Laura time to have a glass of water and take a breather. In the meantime, if there is any questions from the audience, please feel free to ask them now. Again, there is a questions panel on your GoToMeeting panel. And you just type in there, click send, and it'll just give us a few seconds to see some of those questions trickle in, and we'll pick one out. Any of those we don't get to, we can push towards the end during the question and answer section. Okay, we have one here. So Laura, if you own a site but you have contractors doing work on the site, are you criminally liable if the contractor's employees don't have a work-alone program?
That's a great question, and there's a very simple answer, yes. If you're a site owner, you don't have to force your processes or procedures on the contractors, but you are ultimately criminally liable if the contractor's employees are not protected. So as an example, if you have a contractor on your site and there was an employee who was assaulted, like in the previous case, overnight, you could be held liable if that contractor didn't have a procedure in place. So one thing that we recommend is that organizations include lone worker procedures as part of their vendor submission packages. So if you're working with contractors, have them include all of those procedures as part of your bidding process, and that way you can validate yourself that they are up to code. Great question.
Thank you for that.
Perfect. Okay, let's move on to culture and compliance. So we're going to start off this section by talking about the culture side of things. So we've talked about how legislation has evolved, but culture in general, I mean, with the public, with employees, has also evolved. We put a much greater premium on safety nowadays than we did long ago, and there's kind of three factors that are driving that. One is employee demand, second is social advocacy, and three is employer negligence. So just to touch on employee demand, I mean, we all know that employees nowadays are far more vocal about their rights. They know their rights, and they want to be protected. We also have a lot more employees entering lone worker situations nowadays than previously. Another factor that's really important is the fact that within a few years, we're going to be really hitting a wall with the baby boomer generation retiring. And attracting and maintaining employees is going to be critically important. And a huge part of that is a good safety record and protecting the employees. Employees want to work for companies that have the right safety procedures, and they're much more likely to stay if they're there. So that's something to keep in mind as an organization. In terms of social advocacy, there's a lot of safety-minded organizations, professional groups. You've got CSSE, ASSE, National Safety Council, all kinds. But we also now see even organizations that aren't necessarily safety-focused picking up on these issues. So in the example I just mentioned, we have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, certainly not a safety-dedicated organization, yet they are fighting for employees that are facing lone worker situations. So it's a huge point of driving kind of our cultural shift. And then we also have employer negligence. So, I think everybody would agree we're in a very litigious society or point in our history. And with that, we see increased payouts from corporations, and we see a lot larger push for legislation. So while it's terrible to be on, as an organization to be on the receiving end of something like that. A lot of these cases are really what has pushed forward legislation and protection in general for workers, and thankful for the decrease in worker incidents, particularly in lone worker situations. So moving on to the next slide, we have the evolution of compliance. So again, along with the evolution in legislation and in our culture, our cultural shift, there's also been an ongoing change as to how people are complying with this. So I want to cover kind of three main themes. The first one is manual to automated. So traditionally you would have seen a call-in system. You would have had an employee if they were going to be working alone, they would call their supervisor or manager, occasionally perhaps a third party, and communicate the length of their shift, and then that employee would be responsible for checking in periodically according to that company's procedure. So that might be every 2 hours, every 4 hours, etc. This really provides limited and outdated information. So the only information you have is whether or not that employee is okay or they're not okay. And that is really based on the last time that they checked in. So that could be, 2 hours ago. So while it's outdated, it is also still the backbone of most lone worker programs, and for good reason. It does act as a fail-safe. So if nothing else, if there's no technology involved, if there's no visibility of the employee, if they don't check in when they're supposed to, you will be alerted to that and will follow up with the employee. So it still should be a part of every lone worker program. What we see today in a more automated world is a number of things. So number one, improved communication. It's not just a phone call nowadays. You have texting, you have smartphone apps, satellite devices, email. There's a ton of communication methods that make it much easier for an employee and someone who's monitoring them to stay in touch. We also have more context and real-time visibility. So if something does happen, it's not just a missed check-in, and then we have to find out, where that employee is and what happened. We can, through technology, know that that employee is perhaps traveling at a certain speed down the highway and is okay. Or we can know if it's, for example, a man-down technology, that that employee isn't okay, and we need to go to that location, which we can see via GPS, and get to them right away. So a lot of enhancements there. Also move to proactive versus reactive. So rather than relying on a missed check-in to notify us of a potential problem, we have technology that can notify us ahead of time. So whether that be the man-down technology, or an employee hitting a panic alarm on their app, or a in-vehicle monitoring device that can indicate a crash. There's any number of ways to proactively notify. And we also have multiple alerts now, so we can have different unique procedures. So if someone hits a panic alarm, that would obviously have a more immediate response than someone who hit, an assistance button and asked for assistance with a flat tire. So let's tackle the second middle portion there, in-house versus third-party monitoring. Again, traditionally it was mostly monitoring of lone workers was traditionally done by internal supervisors and managers. Now that, while of course they're doing right by their employees, there are some limitations on that. A manager or a supervisor has many other priorities during their day besides monitoring employees. That just makes it so easy for something to slip through the cracks. So with limited resources, there's also the burden of liability. With the legislation now holding individuals criminally responsible, if a manager simply misses an alert due to a meeting or something like that, and something were to happen, they can be held criminally liable, and managers and supervisors really don't want that on their shoulders. So when you look at third-party monitoring, you have 24/7 dedicated personnel. So no matter what time of day someone is entering a lone worker situation, you're not relying on a supervisor to wake up at 3 a.m. and respond to an alert. There's someone there ready and waiting. It's often cheaper. You don't have to worry about maintaining internal staff and infrastructure to do the monitoring. And it makes it easier to respond to alerts because you have all information in one source. So if you think about a supervisor, if something goes wrong, they have to look in the back end of a GPS portal. They have to potentially look in their HRMS system for information on the employee, go to a safe work form. There could be, a ton of different information sources that they're having to go to. Whereas With a third-party monitor, it's all there in one place, and you have a huge team of individuals that can all divide and conquer. The last item that we have there is prescriptive procedures versus a risk-based program. So we're going to dive into this in a little more detail in the next slide, but to kind of talk broadly about it, what we saw traditionally was kind of one sweeping standard to lone worker monitoring that a company would employ across, all of their operations, all of their regions. And while this is a great start, those procedures were often a bit cumbersome because you had to look at all of the employees and all the potential risks they would face, lump it all into one procedure, and it led for really little flexibility and oftentimes a lack of a hazard assessment. Nowadays, as we're moving to the more risk-based approach, we have employees engaged in the process. There's often a hazard assessment involved right off the bat that the employee performs themselves. They take into consideration tasks, location, communication risks. Well, you can have kind of a standard that applies to all of your employees. You can allow for flexibility with different business units and operating regions. So it often results in a more simplified procedure and higher user adoption.